Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. It's Joffrey Noodle Legs here today with little Sullivan. Here he comes. Oh, here he is. Say hello, Sullivan. Hello everybody. Here we are today. Isn't he lovely, eh? Beautiful boy. Got another music top 10 for you. Today I'm going through my top 10 favourite 1980s synth albums. Now, the synth sort of scene, the sort of futuristic sort of scene was my scene. I just got into it heavily, really heavily in the sort of like early 80s. And we used to go to all the sort of like sort of clubs, discos, they're called discos then. And we used to go to the local social club, and we used to have discos up there and run all the sort of like play. There was a little group of us. There was your mainstream people, and then there was us little sort of futuristic sort of gothy sort of people on our own. And I really got into it, and I started to follow a lot of the bands and that. I mean, bands like Soft Cell and Japan. As you know, I went to see Japan. I went to see Soft Cell. I went to see Depeche Mode. I went to see all these bands because they were just so important to me. So I'm going to go through my top 10 favourite synth albums. But first I've got a few honourable mentions because I couldn't fit them in there. First up is Gary Newman's album Dance. This is a great album, a little underrated if you want my opinion. This came out just as he was doing his farewell concerts at Wembley. So this is about sort of like 1981 sort of time, 82-ish. This came out, and he had a couple of singles on it. She's Got Claws was his big hit from this album. But yeah, this was a really sort of like an emotional album because it was a complete sort of vast difference to the albums that were before it. The others were pure sort of a more electronic-y sort of you know, dark sort of synth sort of sound to it, and this was a little bit more sort of like commercial, I suppose. But it was a really cool album, and I really like it. Really underrated album. Another one which was quite a big influence album to me, to be honest, but again I just couldn't find space to put it in to me top 10, and this is called Power, Corruption and Lies, and this is by New Order. This was like I think it was their second album. I think they did like a sort of album before this, which was called something like Factory or something. I can't remember. Really can't. But obviously, before they became New Order, they were called Joy Division. But obviously, they lost their singer, Ian Curtis, committed suicide, and they went on as Joy Division. And then they had some big hits like Blue Monday and stuff like that. But this came out around the sort of Blue Monday time. Blue Monday's not on here. But it's a really cool album. The Age of Consent is a fantastic track, and I absolutely love this album. It's so cool. I've got like the collector's edition of this, which is really cool, which has got like sort of like the album songs, and then there's a couple of non-album tracks on there. But yeah, Power, Corruption and Lies. Another one, now this is a bit of a strange one to put in here because this actually came out in the 70s, but it didn't really sort of become popular into the UK until the 80s. And this is Man Machine by Kraftwerk. There's the famous cover. This is the German version. They released two versions of this album, an English version and a German version. I went for the German version because I wanted to hear it originally. Yeah, this actually came out in the 70s, but it made it big here in the 80s on the back of the single The Model. So that's why it took a while for that to take off here. But yeah, that really came in big, and I think it's because of all the sort of like all the big sort of like alternative club scene that was in London started to obviously play it, and it just sort of took off. So now we're going to the top 10. Took my time getting there, didn't I? But there we go. Now, number 10, it was a bit difficult to put it this low in the 10, really, but it's just the way it's all worked out. And this is Non-Stop Erotic Cabaret by Soft Cell. This was their debut album, Fantastic album. Includes the singles Bed Sitter, Say Hello, Oh Goodbye, and obviously Tainted Love. This was their sort of their debut album. Everybody owned this album when it came out, didn't they? Everyone. Really, really cool album. The night scene there of Soho. This is like a limited edition sort of version of the album. Great album, fantastic, and every song runs into each other. Hence why it's called Non-Stop. So there was no sort of like break between the songs. They all sort of flowed into. Now, the favourite songs on here, I would have to go with Frustration and Youth. They're my two favourite songs on there. Number 9 is a cracking album, this. And saying that because it's got a crack in the case as well. This is called Architecture and Morality by Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark. This is a fantastic album. This was probably their biggest album at the time. They released a couple of albums before this, and then they released one after this. It was really strange because they released a couple of albums before it, and the second one came a little bit quite popular. This was the big album, and then they released another one, Dazzle Ships, which I think I've got here. And they went back down again. It was really strange. But then they sort of like realised, I think, that this was the sound that people were looking for, and they went back on to make more albums that sort of more sort of similar to this, things like Junk Culture. This is a good album. It's quite dark. I really like it. My favourite songs on this album are Sealands. I think it's my favourite song, and I like this particular album's got a couple of the B-sides from the singles, and Sacred Heart and Romance of the Telescope, which were two B-sides of a couple of the singles. The singles off here were Souvenir, Joan of Arc, and The Maid of Orleans. Was that number 8? I think it was, wasn't it? Yeah. Number 8. Number 7. Yeah, it says I'd put it down as a synth band, but they had a bit more varied sound to their music. But I'm putting it in here anyway. And this is The Hurting by Tears for Fears. Now, I love this album. I didn't like anything else they did after this. This album was absolutely fantastic. It stood out. It was quite a dark and quite a serious sounding album. It's got a couple of singles on here, Pal, Shelter and Mad World. But this album was fantastic. But in everything they've done after then, I can't stand it. I know a lot of people like it. Songs from The Big Chair and that just weren't for me. They just completely and utterly changed from this album and went really commercial sounding, and I just thought, no, I've lost interest now. A bit like the Simple Minds. I mean, they released a really good album called what's it called again? Can't remember. Something like New Daydream or whatever. I love the album. It's got the singles Glittering Prize and Promised You a Miracle on it, and it's fantastic. But in everything they did after that, no interest whatsoever, because they changed. I think these are sort of like one of the bands that succumbed to the record company's wants, and they followed that. Yes, they become probably millionaires out of it and highly successful, but I prefer bands that sort of stick to their roots a bit, and they seem to have lost it after this album. But this is an amazing album. That's why it's in my top 10 favourite 80s synth albums. 6, 5, 3, and what number are we now? Let's have a look. Yeah, number 7 next. Number 7 is from one of my favourite bands of the 80s, and this is called Quiet Life, and it's by Japan. This is a really cool album. It's got the single Quiet Life on there. Excuse me, and All Tomorrow's Parties, which is a Velvet Underground cover. This is a really good album. It's got that real sort of 80s sound to it. And it was one of those albums that you could buy in the 80s that was always, do you remember it used to have the sticker on it saying nice price? And it was always cheaper than sort of like the other albums. Because it wasn't as commercially successful as their albums they made afterwards, Tin Drum, etc. This didn't have that sort of, they were just discovering their sort of form then. And so this album was always that little bit cheaper when you went to buy it. It was like all the albums were like £3.99, £4.99 back then on vinyl, and this was about £2.50, something like that. You know, you could always pick it up quite cheap. I remember that. I really do. And it's a great album. My favourite songs on here is Halloween. It's a really, really cool track. Five, four, three, two, one. Right, number six. A band I don't really talk about too much, but I love them. One of the first bands I ever saw. I've got a tattoo of them on my arm. And this is my favourite album of theirs. This was their second album. Came out in 1982, and this is called A Broken Frame by Depeche Mode. I love this album, as you can just about make out there, I think. Can you? Got Depeche Mode tattoo somewhere on there? Just about see it there. See it? Depeche Mode. That's got the rose from their Violator album. Yeah, this came out because the first album, Speak and Spell, was really poppy with things like New Life and I Just Can't Get Enough and that. And this came out and it was a lot darker. It had songs like See You and songs like that, which I really liked, and it was a lot darker than the first album. I think what's his name left to make the Yazoo band. Then he went on to make Erasure. Vince Clarke, yeah, he left, and Martin Gore took over the songwriting, and that's when it became a bit darker. And me and my friend at the time, John, we went to see these at Hammersmith on this tour, and they were fantastic. And that's Broken Frame by Depeche Mode. Number 5 is one that doesn't get talked about at all really by anyone. Really underrated band from the 80s, I think. And this is called Happy Families, and it's by Blancmange. This is the box set version of it, which has got, let's have a quick look. Yeah, it's got the whole album on it. It's got 3 discs, a disc of bonus tracks and a disc of sort of like live stuff and sort of like radio BBC sessions and things. Yeah, Happy Families, Blancmange, really cool band. This has got the singles Waves on it and Living on the Ceiling. Then they did another album after that, which was even more popular, called Don't Tell Me, which again I've got on this sort of format, but this is my favourite. It's a really, really cool album, and I love the artwork on that. It's really, really cool. No one really speaks about Blancmange or the work of Neil Arthur. It's a shame because his work is amazing. They're still about. I believe they're still touring at the moment. But that's a great album, Happy Families by Blancmange. So we get into the top 4. Number 4 is the same band that was in at number 10, and this is my favourite album of theirs, and this is The Art of Falling Apart by Soft Cell. This was their second album, and again I preferred it because lyrically it was a lot darker than Non-Stop Erotic Cabaret. In fact, it's their third album. They had a mini album in between called Non-Stop Exotic Dancing or something like that, which was like a sort of like a remix album, which was cool. But this was a lot darker. The singles on here were Where the Heart Is and Numbers, so they weren't as popular, weren't as poppy as the first album. This is when they went down the more sort of darker route and sort of a little bit more sort of gothic sort of route. They went down that, and I think it's because Mark was doing a lot of work with his other band at the time, Mark and the Mambas, and so they went down a sort of more darker route, and it was like the destruction of the band. That as the band went on, the albums became more chaotic. They only made the 3 albums, but now they've made a couple since, to be honest. But back in the day when they were first together before their first split, that they made 3 albums, and every album got more chaotic as it went along. This was the middle one, and I love it. My favourite tracks on here are Heat and Loving You, Hating Me. Fantastic. So my top 3, number 3, these have already been in my top 10 here, and this is called Organisation by Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark. This was their second album. I love it because it's really dark. It's got really dark, long synth sort of lines in it, which are fantastic. Lyrically, it's cool. It's got a little bit of an industrial feel going on with songs like Stand Low. Singles on here, Enola Gay was the single. My favourite song off here is Statues, but that's a great album, Organisation. So top 2 was difficult because I love them both the same. But at number 2 is Gentleman Takes Polaroids by Japan. It's my favourite Japan album. You know how much I love David Sylvian, and this album is fantastic. It just flows beautifully. His voice is amazing. The songs are incredible. They're just fantastic. I just love this album. This includes the singles Gentleman's Take Polaroids and Night Porter. My favourite songs on here are My New Career and Swing. It's a great album. So we got to my number one, and it's the first time he's been in this top 10, which is surprising. He was in my honourable mentions, but it's got to be The Pleasure Principle by Gary Newman. Although this came out in the end of 1979, I'm classing it as an 80s because that's when it became popular. Obviously, it became popular around then because obviously in the 1980 he also released his album Telecom. But this was the one that sort of that was between Telecon and Replicas, which was his Tubeway Army album. This came out, and this just sold by the bucket load. It was number one and all sorts of things. It's got the singles Cars on here and Complex. My favourite songs on here has to be Conversations and Me. And that is my favourite top 10 1980s synth albums. If you speak to any of my friends or family about me when I was a young lad, they would tell you, yep, they were the albums he listened to all the time. He just listened to them all the time. There were some other bands I wanted to put in there, guys, like Talk Talk, Visage, and things like that. But you could only fit 10 in, so I just went with the 10 that I know that I listened to the most, that were always on my record player. I used to come home from school or wherever I was, if I was on holiday, mum and dad out of work, I would be at home listening to these albums. My sister would always be out doing stuff at the gym or whatever she used to do, but I would be at home listening to this stuff, and that's what I did. So that is my synth albums. What are your favourite synth albums? Let me know down below. Are any of those yours? Are any of those you've not heard of? Check them out. Please check out Blancmange and OMD. They're both fantastic. Anyway, guys, till next time, you look after yourselves, look after one another, and I really hope that I will see you all soon.